At 4:47 in the early morning of May 11th, 1945, Private John McKini lay asleep inside a small canvas tent near Dingolan Bay on the island of Luzon. He had no idea that nearly 100 Japanese soldiers were slowly moving through the surrounding jungle, closing in on his position. McKini was 24 years old. He had served 2.5 years in the United States Army. Before the war, he had been the son of a poor sharecropper in rural Georgia, a young man who had left school after the 3rd grade. By the spring of 1945, the campaign to liberate the Philippines had already cost American forces more than 60,000 casualties. Japanese units scattered across Luzon continued to resist fiercely. They refused surrender and instead relied on night attacks, surprise dawn assaults, and desperate suicide charges against American defensive lines. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment, part of the 33rd Infantry Division, had established a small outpost near Dingolan Bay in Tayabas Province. The position protected a vital supply route that ran through the region. At the edge of the perimeter, 3 American soldiers manned a light machine gun position. McKini had just finished a long shift operating that weapon. Exhausted, he walked a few steps back to his tent, placed his M1 Garand rifle beside him, and lay down to rest. The jungle around the camp was silent, but the Japanese knew the outpost was there. For days they had been watching the Americans from the dense vegetation. They counted the soldiers. They studied the guard rotations. They waited for the right moment. Now the assault was beginning. In the darkness, more than 100 Japanese troops moved carefully through the jungle. They were survivors from several battered units still fighting on Luzon. Many carried rifles and grenades. Others carried knee mortars. Some still carried traditional swords. Their objective was simple: overrun the American outpost. Kill the defenders. Capture the supplies. The first group slipped past the outer guard post without being detected. Leading the advance element was Sergeant Fukutaro Mori. His orders were clear. The first Americans had to be killed silently. No gunfire. Only swords and bayonets. If the sentries died quietly, the main assault force could strike before the Americans even realized they were under attack. Mori moved carefully through the camp until he reached McKini's tent. Inside, he could hear the slow breathing of a sleeping soldier. One quick strike would end the man's life before he could raise the alarm. But John McKini was not an ordinary soldier. He had grown up hunting in the forests of Georgia. His father was a poor sharecropper in Screven County, and the family often struggled to survive. When crops failed, the only food on the table came from the woods. John learned to shoot before he learned to read. By the time he was 12 years old, he could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with a .22 rifle. He trapped rabbits, hunted deer, and spent countless hours moving silently through forests. Those skills kept his family alive. They were about to save his life. McKini enlisted in the Army in November 1942 at Fort McPherson. During processing, the Army discovered that he could barely read or write. They also discovered something else. He was one of the best natural marksmen they had ever seen. His rifle qualification scores were extraordinary. Drill instructors quickly noticed something unusual about him. When McKini moved through wooded terrain, he did it differently than other soldiers. Quieter, slower, more aware. He had spent his entire childhood in environments where a single careless mistake could mean going hungry. The 33rd Infantry Division deployed to the Pacific in 1943. McKini fought through the brutal jungles of New Guinea. He survived Japanese attacks, malaria, dysentery, and the relentless hardships of the Pacific War. By May of 1945, he was a hardened veteran. Quiet, reserved, reliable. He did his duty and rarely spoke. The men in his company knew 2 things about Private John McKini. He was the best shot in the unit, and he always slept with his rifle. That rifle was about to save his life. Sergeant Mori pulled open the flap of McKini's tent at 4:51 a.m. His sword flashed downward in a diagonal strike aimed directly at the American soldier's neck. But in the darkness, Mori misjudged the distance. The blade struck the side of McKini's head instead. The sword sliced through part of his right ear. Blood sprayed across the inside of the tent. McKini's eyes snapped open to blinding pain and the shadow of a man standing above him with a raised sword. He had less than a second to react. Mori was already raising the weapon for a second strike. This one would not miss. McKini's hand found his rifle in the darkness. He didn't aim. He didn't think. Years of instinct took over. He swung the M1 Garand like a club, the heavy rifle but slammed upward into Mori's chin with bone-breaking force. The Japanese sergeant staggered. McKini swung again. The second blow crushed Mori's skull. Outside the tent, McKini suddenly heard movement. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Dozens of men rushing through the camp. The main attack had begun. Blood was pouring from his wounded ear. His head rang from the sword strike. And somewhere beyond the darkness, nearly 100 enemy soldiers were advancing to kill every American in the outpost. McKini grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. What he saw chilled him instantly. 30 yards away stood the machine gun position he had just left. Moments earlier, 3 Americans had been operating it. Now the night was filled with muzzle flashes, shouting, and the sharp crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles mixing with the heavier blasts of American M1 Garands. Japanese troops were pouring through the perimeter from the northeast. They were attacking in waves. The first wave had already reached the machine gun pit. McKini could see figures struggling violently around the sandbags. His mind processed the situation instantly. The machine gun was the key to the entire defense. It covered the main approach to the American camp. If the Japanese captured it and turned it around, they could sweep the entire perimeter with gunfire. Every American in the outpost would be killed. McKini ran toward the position. The 2 soldiers who had taken over the gun after his shift were fighting desperately. Private James Hendricks had already been stabbed by a bayonet in the shoulder during the opening seconds of the attack. The 3rd soldier saw Hendricks fall. He made a split-second decision. He grabbed the wounded man and dragged him toward the rear of the perimeter. It was the right decision. Hendricks would have bled to death if left behind. But it also meant something else. The machine gun was now unprotected. 10 Japanese infantrymen reached the gun pit before McKini could get there. They climbed over the sandbags and swarmed into the position. One of them immediately began trying to rotate the weapon toward the American camp. The others formed a defensive circle, rifles pointed outward, watching for any counterattack. McKini did not slow down. He did not look for cover. He did not wait for reinforcements. Instead, he sprinted straight toward 10 enemy soldiers who had just captured the most important weapon in the entire outpost. The Japanese saw him coming. A single American soldier, bleeding from the head, charging directly at them through the darkness. 2 of them raised their rifles. McKini was faster. He fired at 15 yards. The first soldier dropped. He fired again at 10 yards. The second man collapsed. By the time McKini reached the sandbag wall, he had fired 4 shots. 4 Japanese soldiers lay dead. He jumped into the gun pit. The space inside was barely 8 feet by 6 feet. 6 enemy soldiers were still alive inside that cramped space. Some were turning their rifles toward him. Others were reaching for bayonets. One man was still struggling with the machine gun's controls. McKini kept firing. Point-blank range. The M1 Garand held 8 rounds in its internal magazine. He had already fired 4. The next 3 shots killed 3 more soldiers at distances measured in inches. 1 round remained. The 8th Japanese soldier stood directly in front of him, bayonet raised for a thrust into McKini's chest. McKini fired his last round. The soldier fell. The Garand's bolt snapped open with its distinctive metallic ping as the empty clip ejected. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive in the pit. They heard that sound. They knew what it meant. The American rifle was empty. Before the empty clip had even finished flying from the weapon, McKini reversed his grip. He swung the rifle like an axe. The wooden stock smashed into the first soldier's temple. The man collapsed instantly. McKini swung again. Another soldier tried to block the blow with his arm. The rifle but shattered bone and drove into his skull. The final soldier lunged forward with his bayonet. McKini stepped aside and brought the rifle down across the back of the man's neck. The vertebrae snapped audibly. 10 Japanese soldiers had captured the machine gun. 30 seconds later, all 10 were dead. McKini grabbed the weapon. But something was wrong. During the struggle, the machine gun had been damaged. The bolt was jammed. The feed tray was bent. He pulled the charging handle twice. Nothing moved. The gun was useless. The most important weapon in the entire perimeter was now broken. McKini looked up. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, and in the gray light he saw them. More Japanese soldiers. Many more. They were regrouping at the edge of the jungle, preparing to launch the next attack. McKini stood alone beside the damaged machine gun. His rifle was empty. He had just killed 10 men in hand-to-hand combat. and the next wave was coming. Blood continued to drip from McKinney's torn ear, and the main assault had barely begun. He reached down and grabbed a bandolier of ammunition from one of the Japanese soldiers lying in the gun pit. Inside were American .30 caliber rounds, probably taken from an earlier battlefield. McKini quickly loaded a fresh 8-round clip into his M1 Garand. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the jungle, a Japanese officer was shouting commands. McKini couldn't understand the language, but the urgency in the man's voice was unmistakable. Another attack was coming. McKini settled deeper into the gun pit, surrounded by the bodies of the men he had just killed. He rested his rifle along the sandbag wall and watched the jungle line. He didn't have to wait long. The second wave emerged from the trees about 60 yards away. At least 20 Japanese soldiers formed the front line, with many more behind them. They charged forward at a run, rifles fitted with bayonets, shouting as they closed the distance. McKini placed his front sight on the first soldier and squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand was built for fast semi-automatic fire. A trained infantryman could fire 8 aimed rounds in under 10 seconds. But McKini wasn't simply a trained soldier. He was a lifelong hunter. He had spent years shooting in the forests of Georgia, and he was faster. The first soldier fell at 60 yards. McKini shifted his aim. The second man dropped. Then the third. The Garand kicked against his shoulder with every shot, empty brass flying out to his right. He didn't consciously think about what he was doing. His body remembered. Thousands of hours in the woods. Lead the target. Squeeze the trigger. Acquire the next target. Repeat. The clip ejected with the familiar metallic ping. McKini slammed another clip into the rifle from the bandolier. During those few seconds of reloading, the charging soldiers had closed 20 yards. 40 yards now. He began firing again. The attackers had expected to reach a captured machine gun nest. They had expected their comrades to be turning that weapon on the sleeping Americans. Instead, they found a single rifleman waiting for them. 8 rounds. Reload. 8 rounds. Reload. Some Japanese soldiers managed to close within 15 yards of the gun pit before McKini shot them down. Others tried to break left or right, searching for cover. He tracked them calmly and fired. A moving target was easier to hit than a stationary one. That was something McKini had learned hunting deer. Within moments, the second wave collapsed. The surviving attackers scattered back toward the jungle. McKini quickly counted the bodies in front of his position. 11 more. 21 total since the attack began. There was no time for relief. Japanese officers were already shouting again beyond the tree line, reorganizing their men. Then McKini heard something new. A dull hollow thump from deep in the jungle. Then another. Knee mortars. The first shell exploded 10 yards to his left. Dirt and metal fragments blasted across the gun pit. McKini flattened himself against the sandbags. The second round landed even closer. The third struck the parapet itself, showering him with debris. The Japanese had learned from the previous assaults. They were not going to charge straight into his rifle fire again. First, they would soften the position with mortars. Kill him, or force him to keep his head down. Then send the infantry. McKini understood the problem immediately. If he stayed inside the gun pit, the mortars would eventually hit him. The gunners were adjusting their aim with every shot. But if he abandoned the position, he would lose the only fortified point on this section of the perimeter. A grenade suddenly landed 3 feet away. McKini grabbed it instinctively and hurled it back over the sandbags. It exploded in midair. The blast wave slammed into him, knocking him sideways. Now both of his ears rang violently. Blood from his severed ear had soaked through the makeshift bandage he had pressed against it. Another mortar shell smashed directly into the sandbag wall. Part of the parapet collapsed. Half of McKini's position was now exposed to the jungle. He made his decision. Staying meant death. He grabbed 2 bandoliers of ammunition from the bodies around him, slung them over his shoulder, and ran. The Japanese spotted him immediately. Rifle fire cracked from the tree line. Bullets snapped past his head. McKini sprinted 15 yards and dove into a shallow depression in the ground. It wasn't a real foxhole, just a dip in the terrain. But it was enough. He rolled onto his back as bullets struck dirt inches from his face. Crawling to the edge of the depression, he found a firing position. The Japanese infantry was advancing again. They thought he was retreating. They believed he had abandoned the defense. 2 squads emerged from the jungle, moving quickly toward the gun pit. McKini waited until they were 30 yards away. Then he opened fire. The soldiers had bunched together while crossing the open ground. It was a fatal mistake. His first shot dropped the point man. The second struck the soldier directly behind him. The group scattered instantly, but there was no cover between the jungle and McKini's new position. He shot them as they ran. 8 rounds. Reload. The survivors finally reached the gun pit. Instead of finding a captured position, they found only bodies, members of their own assault teams. And somewhere nearby, an unseen rifleman was firing at them from a completely different direction. 3 more soldiers fell before they even located the muzzle flashes. McKini shifted positions again. He crawled 10 yards to the right while the Japanese attempted to regroup. Another shallow depression. Another firing angle. Then he began shooting again. He was doing exactly what he had done while hunting in the Georgia woods. Never stay in one place. Never allow the target to predict where the next shot will come from. A deer that hears one gunshot might freeze. A deer that hears shots from different directions will panic and run in circles. The Japanese soldiers were running in circles. The sky was beginning to brighten with the first light of dawn. McKini had been fighting for 18 minutes. His ammunition was running low. His ear continued to bleed, and movement in the jungle suggested the enemy was gathering for another large attack. He needed more ammunition, and he knew exactly where to find it. The bodies around the gun pit were full of supplies. Some Japanese soldiers carried American .30 caliber ammunition taken from previous battles. Others carried grenades. McKini waited for a break in the mortar fire. He counted to 3. Then he sprinted across the open ground toward the gun pit. Rifle fire erupted from the jungle. McKini zigzagged as he ran. A bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another cracked past his wounded ear. He dove the final few feet and landed among the bodies he had created 20 minutes earlier. The smell struck him immediately. Blood, burned gunpowder, and the metallic scent of death. McKini ignored it. He had butchered hogs on the farm. He had gutted deer in the heat of Georgia summers. Death had a familiar smell. Working quickly, he searched through the bodies. Every bandolier, every loose clip. He found 4 American ammunition pouches taken as trophies by Japanese soldiers. 64 more rounds. He stuffed the clips into his pockets and belt. Suddenly, a Japanese soldier appeared over the sandbag wall. The man must have crawled forward while McKini was gathering ammunition. His rifle was already rising. McKini fired first. At 2 feet, the bullet tore through the man's chest. McKini grabbed the dead soldier's grenades, 3 of them. Japanese Type 97 fragmentation grenades. He had never used one before, but he knew the procedure. Pull the pin. Strike the cap. Count. Throw. Movement flickered in his peripheral vision. More Japanese soldiers approaching from the left. McKini armed the first grenade. Counted. Then threw it over the sandbags. The explosion was followed by screams. He armed the second grenade and hurled it toward the tree line where rifle flashes were appearing. More screams. He threw the third grenade as he ran from the gun pit again. Never stay still. Always move. By now the dawn light had spread enough to see clearly. McKini reached a shell crater about 15 yards away from his previous position and dropped into it. The crater was 3 feet deep, enough protection from direct fire. From here, he could see the entire approach from the jungle to the American perimeter. Bodies lay scattered across the open ground. He counted quickly. 28. Maybe 30. Some of them were still moving. Wounded soldiers crawling toward the trees. McKini let them go. A wounded man required 2 healthy soldiers to carry him. Every casualty multiplied the enemy's problem. The mortar fire had stopped. McKini understood why. The Japanese had lost sight of him. Their mortar crews couldn't adjust fire on a target they couldn't see. He had perhaps 15 or 20 minutes before they relocated observers. McKini used the time to reload every empty clip he had. His fingers worked automatically. He pressed the rounds down into the clip one by one, feeling the spring resist beneath his thumbs. 8 rounds per clip. After searching the bodies, McKini had managed to gather enough ammunition for roughly 10 reloads. About 80 rounds. 80 rounds against however many Japanese soldiers were still waiting in that jungle. By now the attack had been going on for 23 minutes. McKini had already killed or wounded at least 30 enemy soldiers, but he understood the basic math. The odds were still against him. The Japanese had begun with around 100 men. Even if half of them were already down, that still left 50. and he was still fighting alone. Where was the rest of Company A? The answer, though McKini did not know it, was chaos. The Japanese assault had struck several points of the perimeter at the same time. McKini's position was on the northeast flank, but elsewhere in the camp, men were fighting their own desperate battles on the southern and western sides. The company commander was trying to build some kind of organized defense, but in the darkness and confusion of a night attack, coordination was nearly impossible. McKini knew none of that. He knew only one thing. No one had come to help him. No reinforcements. No supporting fire. Just him, his rifle, and the growing pile of dead in front of his position. At the edge of the jungle, the Japanese were regrouping. Through gaps in the trees, McKini could see soldiers checking their rifles, non-commissioned officers moving from man to man, and officers studying the American lines with binoculars. They had expected to destroy this outpost in 5 minutes. Instead, in 23 minutes, they had lost nearly a third of their force and still had not broken through. Then one of the officers lowered his binoculars. McKini watched him point toward a different section of the perimeter. Not the machine gun pit. Not the shell craters where McKini had been fighting. The officer was pointing at the supply tents. A new plan. A new direction of attack. They were going to bypass the killing ground McKini had created and swing around his flank. McKini understood it instantly. If they hit the supply area, they could enter the camp from an angle he could not cover from his current position. He had a choice. He could stay where he was, in cover, with a good field of fire. Or he could move and try to stop an attack that might already be underway. He climbed out of the crater and ran for the supply tents. They were about 40 yards away. He crossed the distance in seconds. McKini threw himself behind a stack of ammunition crates just as the first Japanese soldiers appeared from the jungle on the southern approach. They had not expected to find him there. The lead element consisted of 12 men moving in tactical formation, headed straight for the gap between two tents. If they made it through that opening, they would be inside the perimeter with clear shots at American soldiers already fighting elsewhere in the camp. McKini opened fire from behind the crates. The first 3 men in the column went down before the others even understood where the shots were coming from. The 4th and 5th soldiers tried to return fire, but they could not locate him in the dim shadows between the tents. McKini shot them both. The remaining 7 scattered. Some ran back toward the jungle. Others dropped behind logs, shallow depressions, and whatever small cover they could find. McKini tracked those who went to ground. Pinned down, they could neither advance nor retreat without exposing themselves. Then he shifted his aim toward the tree line. More soldiers were emerging. The Japanese commander had committed his reserve force to the flanking attack. 20 more men, maybe 25. They reached the edge of the jungle, saw their comrades pinned down, and hesitated. That hesitation cost them dearly. McKini fired into the clustered group. 8 rounds. Reload. 8 more rounds. Bodies dropped among the trees. The survivors pulled back into deeper cover. 26 minutes into the attack, McKini had now killed or wounded at least 35 enemy soldiers. The Japanese had tried 3 different methods. A frontal assault on the machine gun position, mortar fire followed by infantry, a flanking movement toward the supply area. All 3 had failed. The Japanese commander now faced a problem he had never anticipated. His intelligence had suggested this outpost was held by a small American force with limited heavy weapons. Standard doctrine said that speed and numbers would overwhelm such a position during a night attack. But something had gone terribly wrong. One man had shattered the plan. The Japanese commander did not know it was only one man. His soldiers reported receiving heavy fire from multiple locations. They had seen muzzle flashes from the gun pit, then from a depression farther back, then from behind the supply crates. To them, it looked as if several American riflemen were working together, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. That conclusion was wrong, but it shaped the next phase of the battle. Japanese mortar crews shifted their position to the southwest. Soon shells began dropping near the supply area. McKini heard the first impacts and moved immediately. He had already learned the rule. A fixed position drew mortar fire. Movement meant survival. He ran north along the inside of the perimeter until he found an abandoned foxhole. Its original occupant had apparently left to reinforce fighting farther south. McKini dropped into it. This position was better than the others. The hole was about 4 feet deep, with a firing step cut into the side that allowed him to look and shoot over the edge. Then the Japanese attacked again, this time from two directions at once. One group came from the south. The other advanced from the original northeastern approach. They were trying to divide his attention, force him to choose one threat, and expose himself to the other. McKini answered both. He fired 4 rounds at the southern group and dropped 2 men. Then he swung the rifle northeast and fired 4 more. 2 more soldiers fell. The M1 pinged empty. He reloaded in less than 3 seconds and turned back toward the south. The attack slowed. Neither Japanese group could push forward through the storm of rifle fire. But neither group fully pulled back. Instead, they went to ground and began firing into the foxhole. Bullets cracked over McKini's head. Rounds smacked into the dirt around him. Now he was taking fire from 2 directions at once. His ammunition was running low, and the Japanese were beginning to understand something important. The fire was coming from a single place. Not a squad. Not interlocking positions. Just one man. One rifleman who moved quickly and shot with terrifying accuracy. That realization changed their tactics completely. The Japanese stopped charging in waves. Instead, they began advancing individually. One soldier moved while the others fired. Then another man moved. Then another, leaping forward in turns, closing the distance a few yards at a time. It was exactly the kind of tactic meant to crush a lone defender. Even the best marksmen could not easily track several men advancing from different angles at different moments. Eventually, one of them would get close enough. McKini recognized the pattern. He had seen something like it before while hunting. A pack of coyotes would spread out and approach prey from several directions at once. The prey could focus on only one threat. The others would close in unseen. This time, he was the prey. 31 minutes into the battle, the Japanese had crept to within 20 yards on the southern approach and 15 yards on the northeast side. McKini had fewer than 30 rounds left. The foxhole that had protected him so far was about to become his grave. So he made a decision. He would not wait for them to come to him. McKini exploded out of the foxhole and charged straight at the nearest Japanese group. 5 soldiers were crouched behind a fallen palm tree 15 yards to the northeast. They had been waiting for their comrades on the other side to close in. They never expected the American they were hunting to come straight at them. McKini fired while running. The first man dropped. He fired again as he reached the log. The second soldier fell. The third rose with his bayonet thrusting forward. McKini sidestepped and smashed the butt of his rifle into the man's face. Bone cracked. The soldier dropped. The fourth man swung his rifle like a club. McKini ducked beneath the blow and drove the steel but plate of the Garand into the man's throat. The soldier collapsed choking. The fifth turned and tried to run. McKini shot him in the back from 3 yards away. He kept moving. He could not stop. Stopping meant death. The Japanese group from the south had seen him abandon the foxhole. Now they were charging toward him at full speed. McKini turned and fired. 2 men dropped. The others kept coming. He fired again. Another soldier fell. Then the Garand pinged empty. 3 Japanese soldiers reached him before he could reload. The first slammed into him around the waist and drove him to the ground. McKini hit hard. His rifle flew from his hands. The second soldier stomped directly on his wounded ear. Pain burst through his skull like fire. The third soldier raised his bayonet for the killing thrust. McKini grabbed the ankle of the man standing over his head and twisted with all his strength. The soldier lost balance and crashed down. McKini rolled violently, throwing off the man who had tackled him. The bayonet missed McKini's chest by only a few inches and plunged into the dirt beside him. He scrambled to his knees, grabbed his rifle, and swung it in a wide arc. The wooden stock struck one of the soldiers across the temple. The man collapsed instantly. McKini reversed the motion and drove the steel but plate into another soldier's ribs. He felt the bones give beneath the impact. The third soldier wrenched his bayonet free from the ground and lunged forward. McKini caught the thrust on the barrel of his rifle. The blade scraped along wood and steel, cutting a deep groove into the stock. McKini stepped inside the man's reach and slammed his forehead into the soldier's face. The Japanese soldier staggered backward. McKini struck him twice more with the rifle butt. The man stopped moving. 33 minutes had passed since the attack began. McKini was breathing hard. His hands were slick with blood, some of it his own. His ear had been nearly cut away and was now a mass of torn flesh and dried blood. His uniform hung in rags, ripped in multiple places. Bruises and cuts covered his body, injuries he didn't even remember receiving. But he was still standing. still alive. He looked across the battlefield. Bodies were everywhere. Japanese soldiers who had come to destroy the American outpost now lay scattered across the clearing in the dim gray light of morning. More dead than he could quickly count. Movement caught his eye. 2 more soldiers stepped out of the jungle. McKini raised his rifle and realized it was empty. He had forgotten to reload after the brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The 2 Japanese soldiers saw him standing among their fallen comrades. They hesitated. McKini didn't. He charged. He covered 10 yards before they could react. The first soldier tried to raise his rifle. Too late. McKini's rifle but smashed upward beneath the man's chin. The second soldier turned and tried to run. McKini caught him in 3 strides and struck him from behind. 34 minutes. McKini suddenly remembered something. The mortar crew. Throughout the fight, knee mortars had been pounding his positions. He had seen the muzzle flashes earlier, coming from somewhere southwest of the camp. If those crews were still alive, the shelling could begin again. He spotted another rifle lying beside a dead soldier. An M1 Garand. Loaded. McKini grabbed it, dropped his damaged rifle, and started moving toward the mortar position. The 2 Japanese mortar crewmen saw him approaching. They had been adjusting their weapon for another fire mission. Now they scrambled to defend themselves. One reached for a rifle. The other tried to arm a grenade. McKini fired. Both men fell at roughly 45 yards. 35 minutes. McKini stood alone in the growing morning light, scanning the jungle. His chest rose and fell heavily. His vision blurred from exhaustion and blood loss. Every muscle in his body begged for rest. But the jungle had gone silent. No more soldiers stepped out from the trees. No more mortar shells exploded. No more rifle fire came from hidden positions. Only the low moans of wounded men and the buzzing of flies gathering over the dead. McKini slowly walked back toward the American perimeter. Halfway there, he saw figures moving toward him. American uniforms. Soldiers from Company A. They had finally fought their way through the fighting to his section of the line. The men stopped when they saw him. A lone soldier covered in blood, holding a rifle that wasn't his, standing in the middle of a battlefield filled with bodies. McKini lowered the weapon. The reinforcements stared in silence. They looked at the wrecked machine gun position. They looked at the bodies stretching from the jungle to the American lines. 36 minutes after Sergeant Fukutaro Mori had slashed open his tent, Private John McKini was still standing, still breathing, still in control of the entire sector. The battle was over, but no one yet understood what had happened. The soldiers who reached McKini belonged to 2nd Platoon. They had been fighting their own desperate battle on the western edge of the perimeter when the Japanese assault began. It took them 36 minutes to break through to his position. What they found stunned them. Bodies were scattered across an area nearly 100 yards long and 60 yards wide. Japanese soldiers lay slumped against sandbags, sprawled across shell craters, piled near the shattered machine gun pit, and scattered among the supply tents. The platoon sergeant ordered a count. His men moved slowly across the battlefield, checking bodies and marking positions. The process took nearly 20 minutes. When they finished, the sergeant stared at the number. He didn't believe it. He ordered them to count again. 38 dead Japanese soldiers were found near the machine gun position alone. 2 more bodies lay near the destroyed mortar emplacement 45 yards away. 40 confirmed kills, all within the small sector that McKini had defended for 36 minutes. The sergeant found McKini sitting quietly on an ammunition crate. The private held a blood-soaked bandage against what remained of his ear. His uniform was shredded and stained. The wooden stock of his rifle was cracked from repeated blows. He looked like a man who had walked straight through hell. The sergeant asked what had happened. McKini answered simply. He spoke about the tent, the sword attack, the machine gun, the waves of soldiers. Short sentences. No drama. No exaggeration. Just facts. At first, the sergeant didn't believe him. No single soldier could kill 40 men in 36 minutes. It had to be impossible. There must have been other defenders, other riflemen helping him hold the line. But the evidence said otherwise. The 2 soldiers who had originally been on the machine gun with McKini had evacuated with wounds early in the attack. The rest of Company A had been fighting in completely different sections of the perimeter, and the battlefield told the rest of the story. Spent M1 cartridges lay exactly where McKini said he had fired from. The wounds on the Japanese bodies matched the firing angles from those positions. The conclusion became unavoidable. One man, 40 enemy soldiers. 36 minutes. Company A's commander forwarded the report to battalion headquarters. Battalion forwarded it to regiment. Regiment forwarded it to division. At each level, officers read the account and assumed it was exaggerated. Combat reports often inflated enemy losses. Numbers in the chaos of battle could easily be wrong. But the 33rd Infantry Division sent investigators anyway. They interviewed witnesses. They studied the battlefield. They examined the physical evidence. And they counted the bodies again. Some reports suggested the total number of Japanese dead in the broader attack might have exceeded 100. But 40 could be directly attributed to McKini's actions. The investigators reached a simple conclusion. The report was accurate. Private John McKini had single-handedly repelled an assault by roughly 100 Japanese soldiers. He had killed 40 of them, and in doing so, he had very likely saved his entire company from destruction. In June 1945, the recommendation for the Medal of Honor was submitted. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. Fewer than 3,500 have been granted since the Civil War. The standard is strict. A soldier must display extraordinary gallantry and courage, above and beyond the call of duty. By any measure, McKini's actions exceeded that standard. The recommendation moved through military channels. War Department officials reviewed the evidence. They reached the same conclusion as the division investigators. The story was true. Every detail was supported by witness testimony and physical evidence. On January 23, 1946, Private John McKini stood inside the White House. President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The official citation described his actions in formal language: extraordinary gallantry, unmatched courage, and the single-handed defeat of an enemy assault that threatened to destroy his company. McKini did not seek attention. He did not give speeches. When reporters asked about the battle, he repeated the same brief explanation he had given his sergeant on Luzon. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. Newspapers began calling him the Pacific's answer to Audie Murphy, another American soldier famous for standing alone against overwhelming enemy forces. Both men had refused to retreat. Both had survived impossible odds. But while Murphy became a film star after the war, McKini chose a very different path. He went home, back to Georgia. He was 25 years old. He had a Medal of Honor, a third-grade education, and a partially severed ear that would never fully heal. The war was over, but life after war was its own challenge. McKini returned to Screven County, Georgia in 1946. He went back to farming, hunting, and fishing in the same woods and creeks where he had learned to shoot as a boy. He rarely spoke about the war. Neighbors knew he had received the Medal of Honor. They had read the newspapers, but McKini never displayed the medal and almost never mentioned Luzon. When people asked, he answered briefly and changed the subject. But the war followed him home. His family knew. They heard the nightmares, the sounds he made in his sleep, the way he would wake suddenly in the dark, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. In 1946, the term post-traumatic stress disorder did not yet exist. Veterans who struggled were simply told to forget the past and move on. So McKini did what many soldiers of his generation did. He buried the memories. He worked. He married. He raised a family. The decades passed. New wars came. New heroes were celebrated. And the quiet Medal of Honor recipient in rural Georgia lived his life mostly unnoticed. His medal sat in a drawer. Many of his neighbors had no idea. In 1965, writer Forrest Bryant Johnson began researching McKini's story. Johnson was a veteran himself and believed the events on Luzon deserved to be remembered. He spent years tracking down witnesses and military records. McKini rarely wanted to talk about it. Many of the men who had seen the battle had already passed away. But Johnson continued the research. His book, Phantom Warrior, would eventually document the extraordinary story of the Georgia farm boy who had fought alone for 36 minutes on Luzon. McKini never saw the book published. He died on April 5, 1997, in Sylvania, Georgia. He was 76 years old. The sharecropper's son who had killed 40 enemy soldiers with a rifle in his bare hands passed away quietly, surrounded by family. He was buried not far from the land where he had once hunted as a child. 20 years later, Georgia honored him again. In 2017, the state legislature renamed a section of highway in Screven County. Today it is known as the John R. McKini Medal of Honor Highway. A ceremony was held. Veterans attended. His family accepted the honor for a man who had never asked for recognition. Drivers pass that highway sign every day. Most of them do not know the story behind the name. They do not know about the tent and the sword. They do not know about the broken machine gun and the 36 minutes that changed everything. They do not know that a quiet farmer once saved an entire company through courage and violence that still seems almost unbelievable. 40 enemy soldiers. 36 minutes. One rifle. One soldier. One morning in the Philippines that could have ended in disaster, but did not. Private John McKini never asked to become a hero. He was a farm boy who joined the army because there was a war. He fought to survive. He fought to protect the men sleeping around him. Then he went home and tried to live a normal life. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is John McKini.